The UN is the envy of the mafia. The UN is funding terrorism. I found that in Lebanon. We found that in Somalia and discovered between 70 and 80% of the money that was being handed over simply could not be accounted for. And also in the course of that, they found connections to the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization and a connection with Hezbollah. And that was swept under the carpet. Everyone is familiar with appeals by UN agencies the likes of UNICEF, and there's no accountability of how that money is spent and how much of it is embezzled, stolen, diverted, and ending up in the hands of the very parties that the UN is accusing or blaming, supposedly, for the wars that they need the money for in the first place. A filmmaker like you poking around is a threat to them. My name is Peter Anthony Gallo. I was an investigator in the Investigations Division of the Office of Internal Oversight Services in the UN in New York. Prior to joining the UN, I had spent 19 years in Asia. I was a fraud investigator in the private sector. What I was known for, what I'm famous for, is anti-money laundering compliance and terrorist financing. I'm on record of saying that the UN is thoroughly riddled with corruption from bottom to top. I have been saying that for, I think, 10 years. And the curious thing is that the UN has never, neither when I worked there nor in any of the public appearances I have said since, the UN has never been willing to challenge me on the merits of anything I've ever said. I joined the UN in 2011, believing, innocently enough, that the UN would want me to work on financial fraud cases. Nothing could be further from the truth. I fell out with the UN when, after 2 years, my supervisor tried to tell me that I was the biggest moron that they'd ever had in the office, and that I needed to be put on an improvement plan, which required me, interestingly enough, as an investigator, it said I must never ask questions just to satisfy my curiosity. When I actually challenged them on this, nobody could actually answer any questions as to what I had done wrong. I don't believe I actually ever did anything wrong. If, in point of fact, I was half as stupid as they tried to make out, surely to goodness the easiest thing in the world would have been to point it out. But that's not the way the UN works. In October, I believe it was early October 2015, 2 UN diplomats, John Ash and Francis Lorenzo, were arrested and charged with bribery and money laundering offences by the FBI in New York. And OIS dragged their feet on the investigation. Had the investigation work carried out by a junior professional officer who, about 18 months work experience, didn't have the slightest clue, what questions to ask. I was the only investigator in OIS who could even tell you where Macau is, who had any experience of investigating Chinese corruption. And yet, at the same time as this was going on, the UN was going to great lengths to get rid of me. That could be a coincidence. I simply don't believe it. The UN as it exists today is a sad descendant and an even sadder reflection of the organization that was set up in San Francisco in 1945. What has happened to it? It has become a state within a state, if you like. It is completely unaccountable. The organization is not interested in any of the principles which they claim to be upholding. And the only thing they're interested in is preserving their own jobs and protecting this mythical idea of the glorious reputation of the United Nations. The UN has this reputation in the minds of the general public that it is an organization which is set up to promote such ideals as international peace and human rights. And what we are actually seeing is that the organization is in fact fueling abuses of human rights and is completely indifferent to conflicts, international conflicts, and is doing, whatever it is doing to promote peace, if I can claim that it is It is what is actually doing, it is maintaining its existence because it pays very well. In terms of protecting the organization from any form of accountability, the UN is the envy of the mafia. Imagine you wanted to set up a mafia organization. The ideal model is the UN. Your staff cannot be arrested by local law enforcement anywhere in the world. You cannot be sued in civil courts anywhere in the world. Child sexual abuse, rape, drug trafficking. I remember a case of someone being caught with something ridiculous like a ton of marijuana in a vehicle, right? Drunk and disorderly, causing death by reckless driving, theft, anything criminal. The UN has to investigate that administratively, and these cases never end up in a criminal prosecution because of the immunity.
So can't someone just sue the UN then?
Nope. An aggrieved member of the public cannot sue the UN because the UN has immunity. The guy who delivers newspapers to the UN headquarters in New York, if that bill is not paid for those newspapers, cannot sue the UN for non-payment of that debt because the UN has immunity. When I was a UN staff member, if I was sent out somewhere to interview someone, I drove like an idiot, ran someone over, killed a child on a pedestrian crossing, I cannot be sued for a wrongful death. I cannot be prosecuted for causing that death because I have immunity.
Seems like a pretty good setup to avoid a lot of accountability for really awful crimes.
It is absolutely perfect situation for avoiding accountability for any kind of unethical or criminal behavior. Our estimate, a very conservative estimate, is that you're looking at least 6,000 rapes or sexual abuse cases by UN personnel against local civilians every year. Year on year on year. How many UN civilian staff have been criminally prosecuted for a sexual offence? One. Since they started prosecuting, since they started dealing with sexual exploitation and abuse. My estimate, extrapolating on figures that Guterres himself has stated in public, gives a very, very conservative estimate of 60,000 over the 10-year period in which Ban Ki-moon was Secretary General. 6,000 a year, at least.
Do you believe that that number is accurate?
No. That number is a gross underestimation of it. There was a study done by some academics in the United States which reported that in Monrovia, in Liberia alone, I reckon something like 50,000 local women reported some sexual encounter with UN personnel. 50,000. Now, okay, a lot of that may have been consensual in that it was commercial and that they were paid, but they wouldn't have been paid, they wouldn't have been doing it if they could feed their children in any other way. We know that in the Dakoa region in the Central African Republic in 2016, right, the Undersecretary General, the current Undersecretary General of Oversight, was complicit in covering up allegations of sexual misconduct. Because the most important thing is looking after the reputation of the organization. It doesn't matter how many women, children get raped. It doesn't matter how much of the budget is being embezzled or diverted. So long as we all continue drawing our salary and we all convince ourselves that the UN has a great reputation and we're doing good work. Where is the accountability? And the immunity is, in respect of sexual offences in particular, the immunity that the UN enjoys is functional immunity. There is no part of any UN official's job to be engaging in anything sexual with anyone else, So why are we even looking at this from the point of view of it being immunity? As soon as any investigation reaches a point where you have reasonable grounds to believe that an individual has committed an offence against the Sexual Offences Act of whatever local jurisdiction it is time for the UN to wash their hands of it and hand that individual over to local law enforcement to be investigated and prosecuted criminally. Oh, you don't like being investigated criminally by the Congolese police? Well, I'm very sorry, but that is the law in Congo. And if you don't want to run that risk, modify your behaviour accordingly. We have information suggesting that from law enforcement in the UK that child sex offenders understand the benefits of working for aid organisations because it gives them access to children in very corrupt third world countries. And I know from my time in OIOS of reports of statutory rape, of sexual exploitation of girls under the age of 16, right? And when the investigators arrived there, magically the girl's mother, who had made the complaint, had somehow found the money to retain a lawyer to withdraw the complaint. Right? This is the reality of operating in countries where there's a very high level of bribery and corruption and low levels of confidence in local law enforcement. If you're arrested, you're detained in connection with a child offence in the UK, right? You're not going to buy your way out of it. In some of the countries where the UN is operating, a 5-year-old child being sexually abused, we can cover that up for $50, $100. I have no background in the investigation of child sex abuse. It wasn't my area. I was a fraud investigator. But I cannot think of anything more abhorrent. And if there is something more abhorrent than the sexual abuse of children, it is the way that the UN was manifestly unconcerned about it and was quite happy to cover it up.
How do you think most people on the street think of that? Would think of that, like, would react if they realise this? Like this is really shocking. People should know about this. What do you think? Do you have any idea about what's going on with this?
No, I don't believe that the man on the street has the faintest idea of what the UN does, and that is part of the problem. Because nobody cares. The fact that money may be embezzled on an industrial scale out of the UN is not something that's going to take priority over the foreign policy objectives of the major contributing nations. The problem with the general public's view of the UN is that it is far too remote. People in the street do not have a personal connection. They do not see the UN, and they're told that the UN is the good guys, and why should they disbelieve it? The UN has a very solid public relations operation. The UN relies on the fact that anything you can be doing to support such issues as human rights means they are on the side of the angels. We are the good guys. The mainstream media are the UN's darlings. Because if you look at the way that the press corps behave in the press briefings, it's like stroking a pussycat. There are no deep, incisive, cutting questions. There are no in-depth reporting. There is a body of journalists who are basically there to parrot UN press releases. Real investigative journalists, a filmmaker like yourself, is a serious threat. It embarrasses the UN. They don't want the truth exposed. In order for the UN to incur major criticism from the mainstream media, it really has to be something on the scale of covering up child sex abuse, which, oddly enough, is precisely what Zaid did as High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is precisely what the senior management group of the UN did, as it did not occur to any of them that perhaps the systematic and ongoing sexual abuse of children was a bad thing that they had a moral obligation to stop. a filmmaker like you poking around is a threat to them.
How does the UN treat whistleblowers, and are there any protections in place for them?
The UN has an elaborate system of whistleblower protection. There's only one tiny little problem: it does not work. And the reason it doesn't work is because the very offices who are charged with the administration of that system do not want it to work, and are bending and manipulating the UN rules in order to ensure that the chances of a UN staff member applying for whistleblower protection and actually getting it are slim to none. To understand why UN staff members are reluctant to report misconduct, you have to understand the salary structure. Basically, for historical reasons and something called the Nobelmayer principle, the UN salaries are set comparable to the highest paying government salaries of any member state, which is fine. It means if you work for the government of the US federal government, Norwegian government, British government, and you then join the UN to do the same job at the same level, you'll be getting the same salary. Great, fine. What if you're born and brought up in Rwanda? What if you come from Indonesia? What if you come from Nepal? By working in the UN, you're getting a salary which is beyond the wildest dreams of anyone in your hometown. And all you have to do to keep it is toe the party line. UN staff members reach out to me from time to time and asking for advice. And based on personal experience, not just my own personal experience and Emma's and a number of others, and by analysing information in the public domain, like cases that are heard before the UN Dispute Tribunal, I cannot, in all good conscience, recommend that any staff member in the UN report anything serious, because I know that to do so risks them losing their job. They lose their job, they're in the United States on a G4 visa, 14 days later they're kicked out of the United States, it's the end of their career. Women have said that they had to be quiet about sexual harassment, sexual abuse in the office for years, because had they spoken out about it, they would not be promoted to the levels that they have reached. I have no end of the corruption, depravity, and vices that are going on in the organization that are still being kept quiet. Some time ago, when the UN Ethics Office actually published the statistics, I believe it was established that of all of the applications for protection against retaliation, they dismissed 96% of them. These are UN staff members who have suffered retaliation because they reported misconduct or because they cooperated with an investigation. I was one of them. I received, after I complained about the performance improvement plan, that would be the one where I was told not to ask questions to satisfy my curiosity, I received an annual appraisal which was universally damning. I think it was 24 and a half pages long and basically said I had done absolutely everything appalling and shocking. The reason that I was not deemed to be retaliation was because the UN Ethics Office decided that the reason I had the performance improvement plan was because I had previously documented performance shortcomings. The only problem with that is the reason I had complained about it was because they wouldn't tell me what these previously documented performance shortcomings actually were. So this is the kind of corporate insanity that you deal with.
Why is the UN being corrupt such a big problem?
If you just take one aspect of it at random, the UN peacekeeping budget, the basic peacekeeping budget, is $6.5 billion. Now, all organizations lose money to fraud, waste, and abuse. That money is being spent in some of the most corrupt, war-torn countries in the world. So let us assume that only 10% of it is being diverted into inappropriate pockets. That is $650 million a year. So where's it going? Because it's going one of three places. Number one, that money is ending up in the hands of the factions that are engaged in the fighting that the UN is supposed to be doing something about. Number two, it is going into the pockets of local politicians and other corrupt community leaders who have a vested interest in maintaining the conflict. Because if you maintain the conflict, you maintain the fund flow which is going into these places. And number three, is it going into the pockets of senior UN officials who are working in these positions. The current model of UN peacekeeping, if I can call it that, I believe is actually prolonging conflicts. There has been a peacekeeping mission in Lebanon since 1978. There has been a UN presence in countries like Haiti and the Congo for even longer. So where is the peace at the end of this? There isn't any. All we're doing is we're maintaining a presence because, hey, it's good. We're pumping money into those countries and we're nice little jobs and careers for people who work in the UN. The victims of that are the poorest and the most disadvantaged people on earth who, by an accident of birth, were born in the Congo or born in Haiti. I mean, we know from an investigation carried out by my former colleagues in OIOS when they looked at, I believe it was 12 projects by 3 NGOs in Somalia and discovered between 70 and 80% of the money that was being handed over to these organizations simply could not be accounted for. And also in the course of that, they found connections to the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization, who were obviously being paid off in some kind of protection money or other scheme, and overlooked a connection with Hezbollah. And that was swept under the carpet, delayed giving it to the member states, because if they'd given it to the member states might cut their budget for the following year. In other words, right, the UN is funding terrorism. The UN is giving money to NGOs to, I don't know, build schools, dig wells, and do other things for the benefit of the local community. We don't know where that money's going. We know some of it is ending up being paid off to local terrorist groups, and the UN's not really interested in following that up. So anything like that doesn't matter. Terrorist financing does not matter. We sweep it under the carpet so we get our budget for next year.
The UN has an ethics office, though. Surely any internal moral issues would just get resolved there then, surely. This just sounds like a big conspiracy against the UN.
The UN has an ethics office. Yeah, Switzerland has a navy. Try me on another one.
Surely you're not saying that the UN performs all these cover-ups. Like, you just, from what you're saying, it sounds like they're just covering shit up left, right and centre.
Yep. The purpose of what the UN calls a justice system, in reality, is to cover up anything that any staff member reports as misconduct. And that involves the ethics office, it involves OIOS, it involves the tribunals, the registry. The entire system is complicit. So, can the UN prove that there is no corruption in the organization? And their answer is yes. There is no corruption in the organization because nobody ever reports any. And the reason they don't report any, of course, is proof that there is no corruption in the organization. But on the rare occasions when somebody does report corruption and there is an investigation, these investigations very rarely find any corruption. And that, of course, is proof that there is no corruption in the organization, which is fine. Apart from two things. Number one, you have to understand that staff members are not going to report anything serious, any serious misconduct, because if they do, they know they will end up out of a job. And two, look at the quality of the investigation, look at the scope of the investigations. Because UN investigations are very good at actually failing to establish egregious misconduct that would embarrass the organization. So what happens What happens when a UN staff member reports wrongdoing or reports corruption or reports some criminality? Invariably, the investigation finds there was no wrongdoing and that staff member will be retaliated against, and he is basically signing his own career death warrant by reporting it. So he won't. This little model works fine until you come across someone like Emma Riley, who is not standing for this nonsense and who will put her own career on the line and insists and will not be silenced. At that point, you will see the entire weight of the organization descend upon the whistleblower like a ton of bricks. And as they did in Emma's case, even to the extent of firing the judge who was hearing the case before the tribunal, just to silence him. What people need to understand, the backstory to Emma Riley's case. Imagine if you learned that in the late 1930s, the German government asked the British government for the names of German Jews who were trying to seek refuge in Britain. And the British government said, certainly, here are the names. When these people were still in Germany, when these people still had family members back in Germany, you would be shocked and appalled and horrified. And now, that is what the UN had done with these Uyghurs and other individuals who were protesting human rights abuses in China. It is complicity in genocide. In 2013, China was up for election to the Human Rights Council. Okay, fine. Now, there are individuals in China who have an issue with human rights abuses in that country. In order for a Chinese individual to travel to Geneva to speak at the Human Rights Council or to protest China's admission, they need two things. They need a visa to get into Switzerland. And they can get a visa to get into Switzerland because a local NGO will sponsor them, so that gets them into Switzerland. They then need a grounds pass to get them onto the UN compound. And the NGO will arrange for that grounds pass. Consequently, there is one choke point. If the Chinese government wants to know who is traveling to appear at the Human Rights Council meeting, the choke point is the UN, the office, because they know who has been granted permission and who's been granted a grounds pass to get in. And what happened was the Chinese government asked, as a favor, because they weren't entitled to it, they asked if the UN would confirm whether these particular individuals were planning on coming to Geneva. Now, rather than saying no, rather than telling them to f off, what happens? The UN confirms the identities, confirms their names. And you've got to ask yourself, why did they want to know? And you don't need to imagine, because there is testimony from those people whose names were handed over, saying that their family members were visited by the police, they were intimidated, tortured, and that was what pressured them into not speaking out. Look at the story of Rabia Kadir, living in the United States, got a phone call from her family members being physically beaten on the phone, screaming from the abuse and the torture from the police in their homes to pressure her not to speak out against the human rights abuses of the Uyghurs in China. And Rabia Kadir's name was on the list and was acknowledged that the UN handed over. Look at what happened to Kaoshun Li, a prominent Chinese human rights lawyer at the airport on her way to Geneva, detained by the Chinese police, held in custody, and died in custody, basically from the results of torture. Now, the UN insisted that Kaoshun Li's name was not handed over, and the UN insisted that they could not be held accountable for what happened to Kaoshun Li. The only trouble is the UN's story keeps changing. At first they said no names were handed over, and now they're saying that we've stopped handing the names over. And now we're saying, but it was discretionary as to whether or not the names were handed over. And then we're saying, but the names were handed over by phone, so there's no record of them. So if there's no record of them, how can the UN say they have no blood on their hands for what happened to Kaoshun Li? Kaoshun Li had been invited to Switzerland by an NGO based in Switzerland. Why did that organization not protest the fact that she had been arrested on her way to see them in Switzerland? Answer? Well, it may be slightly coincidental that on their board was Navi Pillai, who was who? The previous High Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN. What's more important? A human rights activist who's tortured, died in police custody, or keeping your board members happy and not embarrassing them? The very idea that there is a human rights industrial complex sounds bizarre, but it is a major industry, and that's it.
So where's the UN's shortcomings? Like, what should they be doing? What are they doing, and what are they
The
not
UN knows of human rights abuses in China. They just choose not to do anything about it because the organization would rather have a good relationship with the Chinese government rather than uphold the rights that they exist to uphold. We do not have the privilege of picking and choosing which people we are going to protect by rights that are supposed to be universal. Are human rights actually rights? If they are rights, these are rights that are enjoyed by all people in all countries all over the world. The law has to apply to everyone, or it might as well apply to no one.
What's the official UN budget, and is that the actual budget?
The problem with the UN budget is I don't think anybody even knows what it is. The regular budget, I believe, is $3.4 billion. The peacekeeping budget on top of that is another $6.5 billion. So we're up to what, 10? Over and above that, I can't tell you. The problem is that world governments have other objectives, and their diplomatic objectives are more important than the maladministration of the UN, so they'll turn a blind eye to it. All of the money that is funding the UN, and consequently the money that is being embezzled and lost out of the UN, is taxpayers' money. Over and above that, everyone is familiar with appeals by UN agencies the likes of UNICEF, appealing for money directly, asking members of the public to donate to support aid operations. And there is no accountability of how that money is spent and how much of it is embezzled, stolen, diverted, and ending up in the hands of the very parties that the UN is accusing or blaming, supposedly, for the wars that are causing, that creates the conflict that they need the money for in the first place. The never again. The never again slogan. This must never ever happen again. Well, the genocide has been applied twice officially since then. Once in Rwanda and once at Srebrenica. Both times because the UN was asleep at the wheel. And who was held accountable in the UN for what happened? Hell no, nobody. Kofi Annan was head of peacekeeping. They promoted him and made him Secretary General.